Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, Nigel Farage and the Brexit elephant in the room. Farage, a serial loser in Westminster elections, is trying for the 8th time to become an MP. He'll be standing in Clacton for Reform UK, the party of which he is now the leader. I want to explore what impact that's likely to have on the Conservatives, with some polls suggesting the Lib Dems might replace them as the official opposition if Labour are elected. And also want to discuss why Brexit, the issue which Farage did so much to foment and which dominated the last two elections, appears to have dropped off the radar for this one. I'm joined by Byline Times political editor Adam Bienkov and Peter Core as well. Peter is one of the founders of the National Rejoin March, a grassroots campaign which seeks to get the UK back into the EU. Peter is also a truck driver. He hears from colleagues about the impact of Brexit on taking goods to and from the continent. And we've also got Dr. Mark Goodwin with us as well, a politics lecturer at Coventry University. Before we even discuss Farage, though, Adam, I want to talk to you about the disaster zone that is Rishi Sunak at the moment. Who is advising him? He's doubled down on his discredited claim that a Labour government would add £2,000 to the average tax bill, and then he ducked out of the D-Day commemorations early. What's going on there?
It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, I've covered quite a few election campaigns over the years, and there's always gaps. There's always a big gap at some point during the campaign. I've never seen one quite like this. I mean, we just put this into context. Rishi Sunak announced at the beginning of his campaign, one of his first policies that he announced was that he was going to force all 18-year-olds to do a year's worth of national service. And yet here he is being asked to do his own service to the country just for a single afternoon, and he couldn't even last that. It's just absolutely incredible. And it even gets worse. There was a report suggesting that he had originally tried to get out of attending at all at this event. Downing Street have subsequently denied that, although it wouldn't be the first time they denied something that's turned out to be true. But, you have to take that at face value. But when you look at all of the policies that they've been pushing, trying to appeal to older voters, to more conservative voters, they're trying to squeeze that reform vote. And to put off a gaffe like this, disrespecting the people who died on D-Day, essentially, is just sort of beyond all belief that he could put himself into this position. And this couldn't come at a worse time for Rishi Sunak in his campaign.
Yeah, and as the Conservatives have moved to the right over the years to head off the threat from their own right wing, from the ERG group within the Conservative Party, and also the threat of reform, we now have reform itself reinvigorated by the news that Farage has taken the leadership, that he's going to stand in Clacton. So what kind of tremors has that sent through the Conservatives?
Well, as I understand it, one of the main reasons why Rishi Sunak decided to go for this election in July, because he had been advised by his campaign manager, Isaac Levido, to actually wait until later in the year when the economy had potentially recovered a bit and that potentially the polls might have started to turn back towards Conservatives a bit. He decided against that. One of the reasons which convinced him was that he believed by going early that he'd be able to catch reform on the hop and that Farage wouldn't stand. Now, initially that seemed to work. Farage suggested that he wasn't going to stand because he wanted to campaign in the US, and he said he wasn't ready and it'd be too difficult for him to win in Clapton. He seems to have had a second thoughts about that and decided actually it's now or never. And he's standing now in Clacton, which was formerly held by UKIP, and is one of the most sort of Brexit-leaning seats in the country, if not the most Brexit-leaning seats. It's a seaside town, lots of Leave voters, very ripe for a takeover by Nigel Farage. And there was a belief that once Farage sort of returned to the scene, that it would lead to a bump in their support. That does seem to have happened. 2 polls out in the last 24 hours suggesting that they're just 2 points behind the Conservatives. Former Conservative Cabinet Minister Nadine Dorries predicting actually that it's likely that the reform will actually overtake the Conservatives in the coming week. And that is by all means quite likely, given the margin error in polls and the surge that seems to be happening, that we could have at least one poll quite soon showing reform edging ahead of the Conservatives. And as it stands, the situation with the Conservative Party is looking pretty dire in the polls, looking on course to have their worst ever result in a general election. Were it they to get to the position where they're actually losing even more support and Reform are replacing them as the second party behind Labour, then we could really be in wipeout territory. And indeed, even before this was announced, there were polls suggesting that Lib Dems could end up being the official opposition party. So we're really sort of in uncharted waters here. And this could be not just a defeat for the Conservative Party, but a complete reshaping of the political landscape in the UK.
Yeah, and Mark, I saw a comment this week by Marco Longhi. He's a Conservative MP in Dudley, and he was arguing, as many Conservatives have, that the presence of Reform at the ballot box will more than likely hand a victory at the election to Labour. So what would you assess as Reform's game here? What's Farage and the rest of his colleagues at Reform, what are they up to?
Yeah, the likely impact of this, as you say, is that looks pretty disastrous for the Conservatives. The parties that Farage has been involved with in the past have sort of, I think, much more than people realise, had detrimental effects on the votes of both the major parties. Now, quite clearly in this campaign, Farage and Reform more generally really are making no bones about the fact that they are targeting the Conservative Party exclusively. They're not particularly devoting any time or discussion to what the Labour Party's up to or its positions. I think for Farage, I suppose the question for him about whether he'd stand in this election would be, well, what would be the point, given that he's expecting the Conservative Party to lose? So in the past, his aim was specifically around, the form and manner in which Brexit was going to be achieved and then executed. I think the way he spoke at his conference announcing his candidacy, I mean, if you take his comments at face value, he's looking at a long-term realignment of the British party system. So he said he's intending to be leader of Reform for 5 years. And I suppose what you'd infer from that is that the goal is to displace the Conservative Party as the main party of the right of centre in British politics, or to repeat the pattern that we've seen in many other European countries of these sort of insurgent populist parties basically displacing the legacy or establishment parties of the centre right. So if you take his comments at face value, that's the long game. But in the short term, this is just about the worst news the Conservative Party could expect to get, because the main function of Reform will be a receptacle for the votes of disgruntled Conservatives who, under no circumstances, could bring themselves to vote for Labour.
But it is kind of predicated on the assumption that the Conservatives will lose the election, isn't it? Reform are not going into this election with any pretense that they're going to win it. Even if they win one seat with Farage, they would regard that as quite a considerable coup. But it is about then attempting to reconfigure the right of British politics.
Yeah, and I mean, what Farage has proved in the past is that you don't need a bank of seats at Westminster to have a huge effect on the shape of British politics. I mean, even before Farage came back, the Conservative Party has basically been running as if Reform is a major threat to it for a long time. If you look at its positioning, its communications, they've done virtually nothing, the Conservative Party, to try and persuade people who might be thinking of voting Labour or Liberal Democrats that they shouldn't. They seem very much more focused on the threat from Reform or the positions represented by Reform. So in terms of pressurising the Conservative Party, the effect of Reform and the parties that Farage has been involved with previously is quite substantial, even in the absence of having any great presence at Westminster. But I think the way Farage is talking now is something bigger than being a pressure group that pushes the Conservative Party to more Eurosceptic positions or more, what he would regard as true Conservative positions. He seems to be suggesting something like, the pattern that you've seen in France or Italy, which is a fundamental sort of reorganisation of the British party system.
Yeah, I think the problem that the Farage and the Reform has is their vote is very sort of evenly distributed around the country. And we saw that in the recent local elections, where they won a lot of votes, but they only ended up winning 2 seats out of 2,000 council seats that were up for. So we could have something that was very similar happening in this general election, where if you look at the polls and the seat forecasts, you could have a situation where Reform are well ahead of the Lib Dems and even potentially ahead of the Conservative Party, but only end up with a couple of seats at best, or 3 seats at best, which is, whatever you may think of the Reform Party, is not a particularly great system for our democracy, for millions of votes to essentially be wasted. From Nigel Farage's perspective, he would need to push Reform up until the level of about sort of 30% in the polls before they start getting a massive seats, history would suggest. But he can still cause a big problem in this election, largely because the Brexit Party, which is the former incarnation of the Reform Party, stood down in Conservative seats at the last general election as part of a pact with Boris Johnson. And so by standing again in those seats, they're already off to an advantage, if you like. So they're already having much of a bigger impact in terms of Conservatives losing seats than they will have on Labour Party, because the Brexit Party stood in Labour Party seats last time. So it could have an outsized impact on the result of this election and the sort of the collapse of the Conservative Party votes and Conservative Party seats, even if they don't end up winning more than even just 1 seat or a couple of seats across the country.
And Peter Core, when we talk about Farage's previous party, not the Brexit Party, which preceded Reform, but UKIP, of course, that had a phenomenal impact on UK politics. I mean, you could argue, I probably would argue, that Farage is the single most influential politician since Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and he helped to foment Brexit. Yet, Peter, Brexit is not being mentioned in this general election. Why not, do you think?
I think because, I mean, if you look at polling says a massive majority of this country regret Brexit. And polling even says a massive majority of this country would vote, if there was a referendum tomorrow, to rejoin the EU. So when I look at that, it does kind of baffle me at why the politicians aren't jumping on this as a massive popular policy to help them in the polls. And people tell me it's because the parties, all they're really concentrating on, at least till Farage come in, maybe it's changed now, was seats that are going to win them the election. So they're really concentrating on a small handful of seats around the country and ignoring the national polling to try and ensure they win the election. I don't know if that's going to change now with Farage coming in, because he does seem to be changing up quite a few things. But that's what I'm told. But I find it really frustrating that they're not, because I've heard politicians say that the reason they're not talking about Brexit is because when they knock on doors, people aren't talking about Brexit. And then you say, well, what are people talking about? They're talking about cost of living, immigration, etc., etc. And if you look at the issues people are raising on the doorstep, they are talking about Brexit, because all of those things have either been made worse by Brexit or some of them being caused by Brexit. But then I don't understand why, when someone on the doorstep brings something up that's clearly connected to Brexit, why doesn't the politician at that point say to them on the doorstep, you know, this is because of Brexit, or this has been made way worse because of Brexit? So to me, it's really a failure of our politicians not connecting the dots for people, because I think people out there are talking about Brexit and want to talk about Brexit, but the politicians just, I don't know if they're thicker than me, a lorry driver, and aren't connecting the dots themselves, or if they're being dishonest and aren't connecting the dots. I don't know.
In terms of the practical impact of Brexit, then, what do colleagues who travel to and from the continent tell you is the daily impact of Brexit on their lives and therefore on our lives as consumers?
Well, it's devastating. I don't want to make myself all important being a lorry driver and make out lorry drivers the most important job in the country or anything, but everything in this country is delivered with lorries, from bricks that build houses to food in the supermarkets. Everything is delivered with lorries in this country. So if the price of logistics goes up, it makes the price of everything go up. And that is a massive part of the UK's inflation. And Brexit made the price of logistics go up, because thousands and thousands of lorry drivers went back to their own European countries, a lot of them is because of the pandemic and they wanted to be with family. But by the time it was all over and people could come back, they just wasn't coming back. And the reason is because of the new visa rules. I mean, a typical lorry driver does not earn enough to cross that threshold that the Tories set for starters. So they couldn't come back. And even if they wanted to, we've made them feel really unwelcome. I know lots of European people who have left and won't be coming back. I speak to a few of them still on Facebook, still friends with them. And they just feel unwelcome. They get treated like rubbish. I've walked into a depot before with a European friend of mine, and my friend said nothing, and I spoke first, and people behind the counter just naturally go, "Oh, it's nice to hear an English person for a change." And it's little things like that makes people, my European friend stood next to me think, oh, right, so when I speak, what are you going to think of me if that's your attitude? And it's just little daily things over and over and over like that. We've really made people feel unwelcome in this country because of things like that. But what that's done is the whole world has got a lorry driver shortage at the moment, but every country is at just about coping levels. And the UK before Brexit was at just about coping levels, but we left the single market, which means our driver shortages over here got loads worse. Now, it's forced companies to put wages up for lorry drivers, which is something the Brexiteers before Brexit said would happen. And it's true, it has happened. And you might think I'd be rejoicing, but I'm not. Because for starters, our wages haven't gone up anything like as much as inflation has gone up. So we're still worse off. And I know that a massive part of inflation in this country is Brexit. This is the kind of thing I mean when I say politicians aren't joining the dots for people. And because I'm a lorry driver, I suppose I can see it with my own eyes. I'm able to connect these dots. But most people out there just aren't. And there's loads of different layers upon layers upon layers of things that are all connected to Brexit. So politicians really, really need to get a grip and start connecting the dots. And they need to be talking about Brexit, I think, because it would improve lots of things in it. It's not going to make there was rubbish things happening in this country before Brexit, but that was down to our politicians and their policies, not the EU. But rejoining the EU would make lots of things better in this country. And it's about time politicians started saying so.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting Peter was saying. I think he's absolutely right that the public do understand that Brexit hasn't worked. And there was a really interesting moment in BBC's Question Time programme this week where the host asked the audience who has seen any benefits from Brexit. And initially it seemed like no hands had gone up at all. In the end, one person stuck their hand up and then really struggled to explain what that benefit was. Sort of ended up waffling something about sovereignty, but couldn't quite get his point across. And so, look, politicians know this as well. They can see the effects. They can see during a cost of living crisis that it has contributed to prices. They can see the difficulties it's having with trade and with Northern Ireland and all the rest of it. They can see it just like the voters can see it. But there is a conspiracy of silence about it because all of the major parties don't believe it's in their interest to talk about it. So from the Conservative Party, they're obviously the most closely associated with Brexit. And Boris Johnson in particular led the Get Brexit Done campaign and all the rest of it. But they know that it hasn't gone well. So they don't want to talk about it. They don't see an interest in being able to talk about it. They don't want to have to defend their record on that. The Labour Party, despite promising a second referendum in previous election campaigns, Keir Starmer in particular, who led that push for a second referendum, they believe that that pledge was a big part of them losing the red wall in that 2019 general election. And so they've taken this sort of line ever since then that there'll be no rejoining the EU, there'll be no rejoining the single market, and even no rejoining the customs union. I would question how sustainable that is, really. There was a really interesting interview with the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, on the Rest is Politics podcast. And she was asked about this, and she was saying, look, my constituents in Leeds West wouldn't vote to rejoin the EU. I think that's highly unlikely. If you look at how people voted in her constituency in 2016, it's pretty similar to the country as a whole. And all the polls show that a large majority of the public would now vote to rejoin the EU. And she also said, oh, well, we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. But, politics is about changing the world. It's not about sort of just keeping things the way they are. And she was also pushed on the fact that the next Labour government is going to have not much money to deal with. And there aren't going to be many levers that the Labour government will be able to pull in order to get the growth that she has committed the party to getting over the next few years. And one possible lever to getting that growth would be to take the UK back into, at least into the customs union, if not into the single market. And I do question whether over the course, maybe not in a first Labour term, but possibly in a second Labour term, or in the run up to the general election after a first Labour term, that the party might be tempted to pull that lever as a straightforward way of getting some growth back into the economy, rather than inflicting another round of austerity across the UK.
In terms of them levers, I would suggest that rejoining the EU, or as you say, at least the customs union, is the biggest lever they could pull to get money into the economy as quickly as possible. That's what National Joy March is all about, to try and push their hand onto the lever. It's the biggest lever they can pull, in my opinion.
Mark, is the Labour Party right, though, to be fearful about the red wall? These were, how can I put it, conservative-minded, but traditionally Labour-supporting seats in the industrial or de-industrial north and the Midlands. Places like Dudley, where Marco Longhi, the MP I mentioned before, was fearful of reform. Many of those seats transferred from Labour to the Conservatives, and certainly it's perception that Brexit was one of the key issues persuading people to switch sides. So you can perhaps see why Keir Starmer is wary of discussing it, can't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Adam's point is exactly right. Nobody's got an incentive to bring this up. I think if you look at, so when Keir Starmer took over the leadership of the Labour Party, his strategy was based around initially kind of stopping the rot on what was seen as the two big liabilities that Labour had at that time, which was the previous leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who obviously extremely divisive, very unpopular in certain key Labour areas, and the position on Brexit, which, to say the least, was confused and unclear to voters. So I think the strategy from that day has been to try and reassure voters that the Labour Party is not the Corbyn Labour Party and it's not the Remain Labour Party. And I think given the position that we're in at the moment where the Labour Party are expecting to win, why would you take the risk of alienating some of those voters? The Labour voter base was very, very sharply divided, much more so than Conservative supporters over the issue of Brexit. Why alienate some of those people rather than attribute things like inflation and the cost of living to the incompetence of the incumbent government, which is a message that probably more people can get behind? So I think it would seem at this point needlessly risky to reopen and relitigate Brexit. But I think the scenario that Peter was describing, where you perhaps try and walk back certain elements of the Brexit deal without sort of openly contesting the referendum result, might be in the back of the minds of some people at the leadership of the Labour Party.
Mark, thank you. That's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you to Mark Goodwin from Coventry University. Thanks also to Peter Core from the National Rejoin March, and to Adam Bienkov, the Byline Times political editor. And don't forget, you can read more of Adam in our brilliant monthly news magazine called the Byline Times, which features the best of our online offerings with content that you can't read anywhere else. If you take out a subscription to that, you'll also be helping to support this podcast. So do head over now and take out a subscription if you can via bylinetimes.com. And don't forget as well, we've got a fantastic new range of audio offerings: Byline Times Live with Peter Jukes and Hardeep Matharu, and with Adam, which is a regular feature now, and Utter Bollocks with Otto English and John Mitchinson as well. So head over to bylineaudio.com to find out more about the listening offer now provided by Byline. That's over at bylineaudio.com. This has been a We Bring Audio production for Byline Audio by me, Adrian Goldberg. We'll see you again very soon, but for now, thank you. We'll see you soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.